Okay, so Björn, if you're okay, we should start. Okay, so the second talk of the day is by Björn Reineking, and we will talk about animal movement and how to analyze it.
Yeah, thank you. First, I'd like to also thank the organizers for their perseverance and for coming up with what I think is a really nice format, so that we have on the one hand this intensity of exchange, but on the other hand also not too much screen fatigue. So I really enjoyed this format here in this series. And I'd also like to thank colleagues of mine with whom I had the good fortune to interact during the past years when talking about animal movement. Some of them are listed here. And in terms of what I want to do, it's not so much showing results, but rather identifying some of the problems or challenges that I currently see in analyzing animal movement and where I don't necessarily have the tools to do this myself. So I'd like to start with this quote by John Harper, who was a famous plant ecologist, that plants stand still and wait to be counted. And what I guess is striking in this phrase is that he draws, or at least implicitly, the big line between plants and animals, between those that move and those that don't. And in a way, this is visible also in say corals, for a long time having not been classified as animals, but rather as plants or stones, just because they don't move around. And also when my daughter asked me recently what I was doing, and I said, I'm preparing a talk about animal movement. She said, oh, look, I'm currently also preparing a talk for school. And it was about her gerbil. And in this presentation of this animal, she emphasized a lot the way it moves, that they can jump 17 centimeters high and how fast they run. So in a short presentation, her focus was on this animal, on how it moves. So I think movement of animals is something that is extremely pervasive, that is very characterizing of what animals do. And there's good reasons for this, because movement allows animals to solve some of the big problems in life. So it's about finding food. So if you think of a cheetah chasing a gazelle, or at larger scales, you might think of animal migration in response to changes in food availability because of changes in the season. And then you can think of finding shelter. So this could be the same thing of a cheetah and gazelle, but now from the point of view of the gazelle. But when we also analyzed roe deer, we could see that when it's raining, they do hide in denser parts of the forest. And another important element is finding a mate. And here there are nice examples of butterflies who would fly up hills in the mating season, because those would be good points to find each other in the landscape. So movement is providing a lot of key benefits for animals. On the other hand, it comes also with potentially enormous costs. First, it might be very costly energetically to move in a landscape. Think of moving uphill or moving through snow. But then it comes also with the risk of dying, either by being more visible to predators, or think of roadkill, so animals being hit by cars. So in total, movement is very tightly linked to fitness, to the number of offspring that an animal might hope to get in the future. And so it seems reasonable that as we analyze movement of animals, this should tell us something about the rules of the game that they play. So it's a bit like observing chess players making moves and then trying to infer the rules of chess based on these moves. And that this works, or seems to be working, is something I'd like to show here. That if you look at how animals move in very different types of landscapes, you see that they do move in different fashions, and that this can be interpreted as being an optimal response to the distribution, the spatial temporal distribution of resources. So here to the right, you see three classic movement patterns. So range resident species that spend their lives more or less in the same area. Then you might have animals that migrate, as I evoked earlier. And then you have, which is perhaps less well known, nomadism, so fairly large range movements that do not follow a specific path and that look a bit random, and that seem to be following, or that can be then interpreted as following resource gradients. And here to the left, you see that how these three patterns are placed into a framework of predictability of resources in time, here on the x-axis, and on the y-axis, the heterogeneity in space of resources. So if things are fine-grained spatially, but predictable in time, then it's possible to be a range-resident species because all the resources are there. As the spatial grain increases, it might be necessary to follow over time the resources. And then as the predictability really becomes very low, then nomadism might be the right response. One thing that has really changed over the past years is our ability to monitor and document movement. And this is the basis of what we do here. So this is an example of storks. And I mean, we now know that they migrate and then migrate to Africa. But this was for a long time not so clear. And one of the earliest proofs of that was this Rostocker Pfeilstorch. So in Stork that was hit by an arrow, and the stork was found in northern Germany, and the arrow was could be traced then to a type of arrow that would be used in Central Africa. So at the time, that was the proof that storks really do migrate this far, and not say stop in Spain or transform to mice over the winter, which apparently was also, according to Wikipedia, was one of the alternative hypotheses at the time. And nowadays we can equip these animals with, say, solar-powered GPS transmitters, as we can see on the picture on the top right. And this then gives us highly resolved trajectories of these animals. And it is this type of material that we would like to analyze. And that this is important to, or that we can learn a lot about animals move and how they might also interact with the infrastructure we put in place as humans. It's something I'd like to illustrate with this little figure here, which is showing as a blue dot, that's the blue whale, and we follow it over 1 week in a basin in Chile, and in brown we see ships. And it seems that in several occasions the animal changes its course in response to encounters with these ships. And this is something the way that animals react to a different environment brought about by humans is something that has been demonstrated also at larger scales for terrestrial mammals. So about 2 years ago, a large consortium showed that if you look at how far animals move, here that's the median displacement in over 10 days in kilometers on the y-axis, and notice that this is again a log scale. If you look at that as a function of the degree to which the environment has been transformed by humans, so the human footprint index, which we have here on the x-axis, that goes from low values in essentially pristine environments to to values of 50 if you're in the center of New York. So along this human footprint index, we see that animals move less over a specified period of time. And this is partly due to the fact that in strongly transformed environments, certain species are not present anymore, in particular large and wide-ranging species. But even within a species, individuals tend to move shorter distances when the human footprint is increased. And for this, there could be different reasons. Either there might be actually more food resources where lots of humans are, and so there's less need of moving. But it could also be that there are barriers, either physical or behavioral, that lead to reduced movement. And there's now an initiative going on that tries to benefit in a way from the restrictions that COVID has brought on, and looking at how animals now might have changed their movement patterns during lockdown time. So there might be, at least scientifically speaking, some good things about this. So there is now a lot of opportunity to study animal movement. There seems to be a certain practical interest in this. So what is it that we can learn from movement trajectories? And these are some of the things that we are interested in finding out about. So first is habitat quality. So what is a good habitat? So, I mean, one could assume that the animals have a tendency to move to habitats that are favorable. And in that, we might also be interested in the extent to which different animals of the same species react differently to the same environmental conditions, because this would then be the basis for adaptation. And we'll look at that. And then another element that we are often interested in is to see where animals might walk in the future, which trajectories they might take, so that we then can identify areas where we can mitigate against fragmentation. And what I'd like to do today is talking about two types of tools that we use in ecology to analyze animal movement and trying to answer these questions here to the left. And the one is step selection functions. And then the second one is using randomized shortest path. And I will describe how they work, and then identify some of the open questions I see currently in utilizing these tools. So perhaps let's first start with looking at the type of process that we'd like to study. So we see here an idealized path of an animal that was taken, and we see that it is, so that's the line, that it is continuous in both space and time. And then the data that we are looking at, this is the points on top of that line, they're typically discrete in time. So we have, in a way, already a slight mismatch between the underlying stochastic process and the kind of data that we have. And the fact that data are typically sampled discretely and with GPS tags often also at a constant and fixed rate. One of the key tools for analyzing animal movement have been devised with discrete time in mind. And perhaps, well, the classic way of analyzing the movement or the trajectory of an animal is with random walks. It should be saying random walks on top. So we have mu-t, which is the position of the animal at time t, and that is given, or we can model it as the position at the previous time step, and then we add some stochastic term, in this case, a normal distribution that is symmetric. And the different way of writing this equation then is that we're interested in the probability distribution, the probability density of the new position at time t, given the position at the previous time step, and some parameter sigma. And we say, okay, this is given now by this normal distribution with a mean mu t minus 1 and a certain variance. And to the left, this would be then the depiction of the density in lines of equal density, overlaid on some map that indicates different habitat qualities. And we see that in this very simple model, the habitat quality does not affect at all the probability density of the next position. And this was, in a way, the sort of generalizing the simple random walk to something that takes into account environmental conditions is the key idea behind step selection functions. And what happened, the way this is being done is that we now describe this probability density of the position at time t as a function, or as a combination of two elements. We have, on the one hand, g of x, where x is now the environmental conditions at a given position. And then we have certain parameters beta that translate the environmental conditions to the probability that the animal moves there. So that's the part, this function g is the function of habitat selection. And then we have a second part, the function f, which is describing the movement kernel. So this is essentially a function of the distance, saying that the animal will have a tendency to stay more or less closely where it was. So the one potential function for f would be the normal distribution that we had seen earlier. And then we need to normalize the nominator by doing the integral of these relative weights over all the positions, or over all the positions in the landscape. In practice, then we choose log linear functions for the way how we relate the environment to the selection. So the g of x is then the exponential of some x times beta, and the function for the movement kernel is then also the exponential of some linear combination of distances or functions of distances with some parameters theta. And what that then gives is shown to the left, where we see for increasing values of betas, how the probability density of the next position changes and becomes more and more centered around the high habitat quality areas. So this is the basic idea of step selection functions. In practice, it's we don't really do an integral, but we approximate it by summing over a certain number of alternative step positions. So you see here to the left, the red dots that are the observed positions, and then around each position we place a certain number of randomly located positions in the landscape, and then we approximate the integral with the sum of the weights to moving to a certain area over all these alternative positions plus the position that was actually chosen. And this can then very easily be fitted with conditional logistic regression, or under certain conditions one can also use or one can one can also use Poisson regression if it's properly specified. What I'd like to do now is first show some of the ways this can be applied, and then identify one particular methodological challenge that I'm currently facing. And so why is it that this approach is interesting, or how can it be used? And this is an example how it was used very early in the field by looking at where one should put a bridge for over a highway so that jaguars could cross this new highway. And so jaguars were equipped with GPS, and then in the first step it was quantified how they react to environmental conditions, and that's what we see here. So this is the first type of output that we get from a step selection function. It would tell us how much the animals prefer or avoid certain environmental conditions. So here they tend to prefer areas with a high NDVI, which is a variable derived from remote sensing that is a measure of greenness. So the animals tend to go to areas that are greener. They tend to avoid roads, so they tend to prefer areas that are far away from roads. And in particular, the female jaguars tend to avoid dense human population areas. So this is the first type of output that we get that is interesting for ecologists to see what kind of environmental conditions are preferred or avoided. What is nice about this approach, because it's a standard regression context, we can make these parameters that we estimate, so the selection parameters, the betas, a function of time. So it's fairly easy to do that. And this then allows us also to see how, here for an example of elk in Yellowstone, how they prefer, or how the preference for a certain habitat type, like the grassland in the lower left corner, changes over time. So we have the selection strengths, the value of beta on the y-axis, and the time of the day on the x-axis. And we see that, for example, grassland is strongly preferred when it's dark, and not so much preferred during daytime. And this is something that is, in this case, not particularly surprising, but this allows us to get fairly fine-grained understanding of how animals react to the habitat. Then one of the big benefits of these step selection functions is that we can simulate trajectories from it. So we can just, because the model predicts, given that the animal is at a given place, where it might be next, we can use this to simulate trajectories. And this gives, first, if you do this over a long time, results like here to the left, where we see what's the average cell use in the long term. But it does not only give us that, but it gives us actually the path between points. And this is what was then used to find places that might be useful for the crossing. So we see here on the top left, on the x-axis, the road, or the kilometers along the road, and then on top of that we see for both males in light gray and females in dark gray, the number of crossings that were simulated over the different stretches of the road. And this then would allow to identify areas that might be more useful or more used by the jaguars if the bridge was built there. So the step selection function allows us to quantify habitat quality, and also allows us to quantify habitat quality potentially as it varies over time. And what's also possible is that we can quantify for different animals how they might, of the same species, that they might differ in their response to the environmental conditions. So this would then be achieved by devising random effects models for conditional logistic regression. And this had been done, and what we were interested in with a PhD student of mine was to see whether we can not only quantify the variation between animals, between individuals, but also look at the variation in selection strength within a given individual. And we were interested in that because we wanted to quantify what is called repeatability. And repeatability means that one behaves differently than others in the same situation, and that one does that consistently, so that the variation that the individual shows itself over time is less than the variation across individuals. So we see this here in this formula, that repeatability can be measured as the fraction of the total variance meaning the variance among individuals plus within an individual, compared to the variance that comes between individuals. I mean, the reason why it's important to also take into account within individual variance is that if there is, we need to scale in a way the variance between individuals to the overall variance. If every individual behaves very differently itself over time, then even a fairly large difference between individuals is not something that is necessarily heritable. So we wanted to study this concept of repeatability in the context of step selection. And we felt that step selection should be very well suited to quantify repeatability, because we observe over time, several times, that an animal selects something, because at each step it potentially could have gone rather into the forest or an open habitat, say. And so we fitted this type of model where the probability of choosing a certain location depends on a weight W of that location. And here we formulated this weight, again, as an exponential function of the environmental conditions X at that location. And instead of only using a beta, sort of the average response, to these environmental conditions, we added two random effects. The first random effect was VI, which represents the individual, or the variance between individuals. So either avoiding more strongly or preferring more strongly than the average animal the environmental conditions X. And so that is, again, a fairly standard thing to do. But what was less standard was then to add at the level of individual steps within individual effects. So for each step, we wanted to add a modification of the preference for the environmental conditions. And we managed to fit the model, but the issue we are currently having is that the reviewers were not very happy with our approach. And the main argument, the main technical argument, was that they believed it's not identifiable. So because there's we need a per observation random effect with a Wij, they believed that we were not be able to fit this. And then the thought experiment by the reviewer was, what happens in the landscape with only two environmental conditions? So say it's forest or non-forest. And in that case, it's indeed not possible to identify Wij. But our position is, or our intuition is, and this is what we seem to be seeing in simulation, but we cannot show that as we have more than two values or different values of the environmental conditions, then we should be able to fit this model. So this is something where we're kind of stuck, and I think would be nice to hear whether you feel that this could be actually shown that this is identifiable, or what would be a good way of showing that this is a sound way to proceed. Now, when I talked about the many benefits of step selection functions that we see here to the left, but there are also some notable challenges. And the first main weakness is that we are bound to a single fixed time scale in this approach, because we also assume that individual steps are independent of each other. And this means that we currently cannot often cannot make use of the fine-grained data that are coming in. And this is an area where it would be really nice to think about how this step selection approach can be moved to a domain where we can go to finer and finer timescales. And the second main obstacle that we see with step selection functions relates to the fact that even if we can nicely simulate from the model, this is a fairly slow process. So it's really not feasible to run enough simulations in large landscape so that we can quantify all the nice quantities about future trajectories that we might be interested in. And this is where graph theoretical approaches come in that have been used in ecology for quite some time, in particular circuit theory and least cost path. And they can both be used to identify future trajectories. And the new kid in town, in a way, for ecologists at least, in this area is randomized shortest paths. And I'd like to introduce that approach a bit, and then identify areas where I think this approach could be expanded. Now, when we talk about graphs in the landscape, then for ecologists working with animal movement, we construct the graph often as based on the landscape raster. So we see here in the top left a potential path of an animal traced in red on some rasterized landscape with different values in gray indicating different degrees of avoidance or preference. And to the right, this is the starting of how this landscape can then be represented as a graph. So the points that in the different cells would be the nodes, and then the white lines or the red arrow would be the edges, always linking or connecting adjacent nodes with either using a neighborhood of the 4 nearest neighbors or the 8 nearest neighbors. And some of the models then also allow that the movement goes back to the same node, so sort of an edge can connect a node to itself. And this setting then is that we have a graph that is finite and strongly connected and weighted, with the node set given by the cells and an edge set defined, well, depending on the geometry that one wants to choose. And yeah, then the nodes then define, or the nodes with that are connected are those that where both nodes are part of the, where the edge between the nodes is part of the edge set. And then this gives us a path of different of length L, and these are just the sequence of nodes from an initial point, from initial node to a terminal node. And the key way now to make or bring ecology in this is via the weights. And there are traditionally two ways. And the randomized shortest path uses both and uses both independently. The first is affinities. And these affinities define a random walk on the graph with certain transition probabilities. So the probability, the random walk probability of going from node I to node J is the affinity Aij divided by the sum of all the affinities that go from node I to successor node of I. So this looks very much like the type of function we would use for step selection. And that is also one of the reasons why step selection functions are then often used to parameterize these graphs. Yeah, because I mean, it looks very, very similar from the approach, although here in this graph, we are only looking at the immediate neighbors, whereas in the step selection function, we look at typically at much larger spatial areas that are covered from one step to the next. So it's not necessarily very obvious how these two affinities that we have in these two approaches really map onto each other. The second variable or second way of defining weights is via edge costs. And these would then define the optimal movement. So with the idea that costs should be avoided. And the cost of a path is simply given as a sum of all the edge costs along its path. And this is then used, this cost of to, for example, define least cost path. So the path along in a landscape between two nodes that has the lowest cost. And as I said earlier, the nice thing about randomized shortest paths is that it allows us to independently define the affinities and the edge costs, but it's also possible to define one in terms of the other. And popular choices for this is that the cost is the inverse of the affinity. So this is something that if one wants to interpret the graph as a graph for electrical currents, then this would be sort of the cost would be then the resistance. Or we could also use as cost the negative logarithm of the affinities. This I feel is closer to the idea that is underlying the step selection function approach. And just to visualize what kind of path you could simulate with these two different perspectives. So we on the top, we have color-coded data or the sort of path simulated between an area in the north and in the south, where sort of red means more movement. And the top is simply the multiple paths that the random walk would give us, whereas the lower figure shows something that is already very close to least cost path. So you just get only one particular path that is favored. And from just intuitively from a point of view of an ecologist, sort of the least cost path is nice in that it has some idea about the animal choosing an optimum path, but it seems too extreme. So there's a lack of randomness, of uncertainty in the animal moving from A to B. And on the other hand, the top graph with a pure random walk, even if it's biased, seems to suggest that the animal does not really learn over time and does not optimize the costs. So that's where it's interesting to look at this concept of randomized shortest path, which allows to scale between these two extremes. And it does so by giving a weight to the different, so when it calculates the probability distribution of potential path between a node S and a node T, it starts with the probability distribution of the random walk distribution, so the PRW, and then weights each of these path by the cost of that path. It's here with C tilde, and the way they are, the costs are weighted is with the parameter beta. So if beta is 0, we get the same randomized shortest path distribution as the distribution that we get for the pure random walk. And as beta is getting larger, then the path with low costs get more and more weight up to the point that we end up with the least cost path. And an early example of how this can be used is what was done for reindeer in Norway, where we see in the top right corner a blue and a green area between which the animals would move. And on the left-hand side, we see for different values of this parameter theta, how the path that are simulated, or the expected number of passages per pixel change as the degree of randomness is reduced, or in other words, how the importance of costs of movement costs is increased. So on top we have the top left, we see the density of GPS points in red as a measure of the number of passages per pixel. And then we see for the extreme case of the random walk, for theta 0, we see a distribution of passages, and then an intermediate value, which was deemed to be the best or the most, the best value for theta, and then the least cost path below. And similarly to the right, we see the distribution of road crossings, and see that again the problem with the least cost path is that it's too peaked, whereas, and on the extreme other case, the random walk is too broad. I think us. Well, I want to show one potential example of this approach that where this can be used. So this is here a whooping cranes migration. That's an whooping cranes in the US are a species that are highly endangered, and they show migration. So in the winter they're in Florida, and in the summer, at least this group is then up in Wisconsin. And all these individuals had been raised in captivity and released then. And because they have to learn to migrate, they do this first with ultralight flights, as you see in the bottom right. Yeah, so they think that sort of this thing is their mother, and they fly behind it. And then after the first trajectory, they are released, or then they have to find their way home by themselves. And what Thomas Müller and others showed, that over time, the animals really do improve the way they use the landscape. And initially, so we see this in differently colored dots. So the red dots are groups of birds where the oldest bird is still very young, and as the oldest bird gets younger, the animals follow more and more a straight line. And at the time, they quantified the improvement just as the reduction in the deviation from a straight line. And I think the randomized shortest path would allow us to quantify the learning of the birds now by quantifying the parameter theta. And I think this could then be a nice way to integrate this in a more explicit then way of simulating future trajectories. So when we talk about the randomized shortest path, it's nice that it can calculate fairly quickly a certain number of distance measures. What's also nice is that there is a fairly strong scientific community working with this. So in particular in image analysis, this is where a lot of the technical development is happening. But when I think now as an ecologist of this approach, as much as I see a lot of potential, there are two things right now that bug me a bit. The first is we don't yet have a very well established method of parameterizing these graphs. And the second point is that it seems to me that typically we assume that the costs and also the affinities are constant over time. And this clearly, when we think back to the movement path that we had by animals that are migrating or that show nomadic behavior, this is not the case. So I'd be really curious to learn about graphs that work with probability distributions over the costs and the affinities. So where to go from here? Very specific, very personal things that I'd be interested in is how to look at identifiability of step selection functions per step random effects and developing continuous time version of step selection functions. And when it comes to randomized shortest path, test an existing proposed framework for combining step selection function and randomized shortest path. And also, learning about graphs with dynamic and stochastic costs. Thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to discussions.
Okay, thank you very much, Björn. Do we have any question in the audience?
May I ask a question?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. So this first Markov approach, there is this memoryless property, but of course a lot of animals have a good memory of where they've been. So I wanted to ask if there are developments where people use things like self-enforced walks, which have a memory.
So there are versions where we use the same approach with the step selection function, where it still remains memoryless, but one integrates, say, the density of past visits and use that as an interacting factor with environmental conditions. So that is one easy way of bringing, in a way, memory into the still memoryless step selection function. I'm not sure whether that's clear what I'm saying. So you build a map of past visits or a density of past visits and use this as a covariable to explain what is happening. Then there is there's interest in using more memory there, but I haven't seen approaches that go much beyond what I just described. So I think there would be potential of importing ideas from other fields.
Yeah, thanks. It is a form of memory. I think it's a very natural form of memory that you described. So, yeah, thanks.
Okay, thanks. Okay, if we, well, let's say I will ask a question? I was wondering about the data that you work from. So you were talking about discrete time grids, and I guess in your models you assume that the time grid is homogeneous. And
Yes.
I was wondering if in the data they are, or it's an approximation, or.
So in practice, it's essentially always an approximation. It can be a good approximation or a bad one, because many of the data come from GPS loggers.
Mm-hmm.
So and then I guess also when we use our phones, typically the GPS logger in our phone is set to a regular interval. So say every 15 minutes you get a location, and in that case, then working with these regular time interval of every 15 minutes or every 20 minutes or whatever is fine. So it's a representation of not necessarily of what's going on underneath, but it's a representation that is very much aligned with the kind of data we get.
Okay.
But clearly there are gaps in the data, and then also there sometimes there's interest in recording over some periods of time data in at a high frequency, so say every minute. But since the batteries are not strong enough to record the data always at the minute, so you have 1 hour where it records every minute, and then for the rest of the day it's every hour, and that's not so easy to analyze that data with this approach of step selection function, because it assumes that you use the same grid. I mean, I guess one way would be to think about how to combine parameter estimates that are done for estimates on shorter time periods with longer time periods. But I mean, in general, in animal movements right now, one of the key areas of development are areas around or are methods around continuous time movement models. So because they allow them to use the data as they come, and you get rid of the inherent scale effect that you always have when you discretize things. And it's not so easy to transpose the results from things you did at 1 hour time intervals to 5 hour time intervals and so on. So that's a big area of research in our field to bring together models that work on continuous time with those that work on discrete time.
I guess. Okay.
I mean, I guess that's not. I mean, it's not only in our field, but in our field, it's just that the easy accessible tools work in discrete time, and the fancy things with continuous time, they are often computationally more intense when you want to fit it to data, and then therefore we do not yet have many tools that would allow to integrate environmental conditions.
Okay. Okay, I see. Okay. If there is still no question, I should ask another one, maybe more about the. I'm not sure I exactly understood the stuff with the jaguars. I mean, if I understood correctly, the model was used to predict the movement of jaguars in response to the construction of a new bridge, right?
No, then I was really not clear. Sorry. They wanted to construct a bridge for jaguars. So not and that is currently one of the major tools of dealing with fragmentation of habitats because of highways. I mean, the motivation for this is typically not that one thinks of the poor creatures, but that collisions between animals and vehicles really cause the loss of human lives, and that's what's motivating these
so the idea is to know where they cross without bridge and to put the bridge at this location.
Exactly.
Okay, I understand.
And I mean, obviously, it's a big step from going from the observed movement of some animals somewhere in the landscape to extrapolating the rules governing their movement to the landscape scale, to then identify where you would want to build a bridge. So I guess what people normally would do is, I mean, you build the bridge where you can, and then you would more use general knowledge where animals would cross. But here the idea was, well, can we somehow extrapolate from existing trajectories of animals to the landscape scale?
Okay, and I was wondering also, how do you get this habitat quality covariate?
That is
it's not an estimation.
Always remote sensing.
Sorry?
Remote sensing most of the time. So what you get is, you don't measure directly the quality, but you measure, say, the greenness of the vegetation.
Okay.
And then you the parameter that you estimate is to what extent the animal prefers or not more or less green areas. Yeah.
Okay.
So, I mean, sometimes you can go further than that. You can then try to interpret the satellite-based values, because that's the only thing that you typically have really for the whole landscape. But if you then measure in some areas the type of vegetation you get, you could then go so far as to calculate the nutrient content or the fodder quality of a certain area. And then you use, in a way, a statistical model to predict the food quality in the landscape based on the satellite data, and you use that value as you use the predicted food quality then in the further analysis.
Okay. And wouldn't it be interesting to, okay, sorry, Diala, next is you, to estimate this quality thanks to the trajectories? You know,
yes. I mean, that's in ways it would be the holy grail. Yeah, that's what I tried to say initially. So we try to learn the rules of the game. So we learn the chess rules from observing chess players. Yeah, and I mean this general question of inferring rules from observed behavior that you assume to be optimal, that would be then called inverse reinforcement learning, which is something that is currently, as I understand, used to train also cars to some extent, to learn from observed driving behavior, to learn what are the rules that actual drivers use. The better known approach right now is reinforcement learning. So that's what was used to build super chess computers or Go computers, where essentially you know the rules and then you find the optimal behavior for these rules. Here it's the other way around, but it's exactly what you say. So can you infer the quality of habitat based on the observed behavior? The problem there is then that you somehow have to assume that the behavior is already optimal, and that's what the crane migration example was about. That sometimes the animals do not behave yet optimally. So you find yourself in a situation. I can assume that they behave optimally, and then I can infer what perhaps the quality. But then in other cases, I actually want to learn how fast they adapt to new environmental conditions. So there I need to know what the conditions are, and then I can quantify the learning rate. But yeah, that's exactly what what we're keen on doing.
Okay, thanks. So Diala?
And I mean, it was just
yeah.
because he kind of answered my question.
Okay.
Because it had to do with the fact that, yeah, if their behavior is also constantly changing, how badly would that affect the models? And at the same time, I think there's also another aspect, which is specifically for the Jaguar example. By building the bridge, for example, that could also select for a given kind of individual that has a given kind of behavior. So we're also modifying behavior by doing this, and we don't know what consequences that can have. And I don't know how this can be accounted for in models. Could it just be, could we add noise? Would that be enough? Or would there be something more, I don't know how to say it, but like more quantitative that can be done to account for this?
For the, I mean, the first point that, the point that you raise here is anyway going beyond what we typically do, because you say something about what would be the consequences at the population level of changing environmental conditions.
Basically, and because this bridge will be a changed environmental condition, and it will select for the individuals that will choose this bridge. So that is a selection for behavior. Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, if you want to, I mean, I think this is what we ultimately need to be able to do, to go from movement rules to the impact it has on the populations. But to do that, you have to somehow integrate really mating behavior, and you have to integrate sort of how behavioral rules are then really translated to the next generation. So that's a whole new set of processes that need to be integrated. And here, what we typically do when we analyze movement is we don't go really so far as to explicitly look at population dynamics. We just take a population of animals that behave in a certain way, and in a first step, we actually already are very happy when we can characterize the variation in behavior that they show. But yes, I mean, at some point we need to go forward if we want to project what are the consequences of changing landscapes in a certain way. It's not only predicting how paths might change, but what that does to the population dynamics.
I mean, also maybe, like, I don't know if this is even possible to measure, like the speed with which behavior can change depending on specific life histories. Maybe there are some species where the time to evolve new behavior just takes so long, like you were saying, how the information is transmitted from one generation to the next. And maybe there are others where it'll be so fast that it might require, but okay, thank you.
Yeah, no, but I guess sort of quantifying the speed with which animals learn is something where this randomized shortest path might come in, where you see that the animal, although the landscape hasn't changed so much, changes really its behavior, and that the path become more narrow in a way, because they tend to learn to pick the good way of going from A to B rather than running around a bit more random.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I guess we could close the question session for this talk. Thanks again, Björn.
Oh, thank
and
you.
thanks to Christophe once again for this nice session. So I don't know, I was not here the previous days. I don't know if there is a short break before the discussion. I guess no.